For 14 months, Jessica Barnes stood behind the register at Eagle Point Firearms Gear, scanning barcodes and counting change while customers dismissed her as just another minimum-wage cashier who knew nothing about weapons. They saw her as invisible, unremarkable, someone who belonged behind a counter rather than behind a rifle. But Jessica was hiding military expertise that would leave everyone speechless when she assembled an AR-15 in just 8 seconds, proving that the most dangerous assumption is underestimating the quiet person serving your coffee, ringing up your purchases, or simply trying to blend into the background. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m. every morning in Jessica Barnes' cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of Austin, Texas. At 28, she had perfected the art of becoming invisible, starting each day with the same routine that had kept her under the radar for over a year. Black jeans, plain gray polo shirt with the Eagle Point Firearms Gear logo, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that revealed nothing of the precision and discipline that had once defined her life. Jessica would arrive at the sprawling gun store 15 minutes early, parking her weathered Honda Civic in the back corner of the employee lot where it wouldn't draw attention. The massive neon sign reading Eagle Point Firearms Gear, Texas's premier gun destination, cast an orange glow over the parking lot, illuminating a world she had once commanded, but now served from the margins. "Morning, register girl, Craig." Thompson would grunt as she passed his office, not bothering to look up from his morning coffee and sports headlines. As store manager, Craig had made it clear from day one that cashiers were the bottom of the food chain at Eagle Point. At 45, he was a man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting suit, constantly reminding everyone of his position through small acts of dominance and casual cruelty. Jessica would nod silently and take her position at Register 3, the station closest to the ammunition displays where she could observe the steady stream of customers who came through the doors. Hunters preparing for deer season, competitive shooters seeking the latest gear, first-time buyers nervously purchasing their initial firearms, and military contractors restocking their personal arsenals. Each customer represented a different relationship with the weapons that surrounded them, but most shared one thing in common. They assumed the young woman behind the register knew nothing about what she was selling. "Excuse me, miss," customers would say, their voices already dismissive. "Can you get someone who actually knows about guns to help me?" The assumption was automatic, ingrained, and Jessica had learned to respond with the practiced smile of someone who had accepted her place in their world. "Of course, sir. Let me get someone from the floor for you." But while Jessica maintained her invisible persona, her eyes were constantly working. When a customer struggled to properly inspect a rifle, she noticed. When someone held a pistol with poor grip technique, her fingers would unconsciously adjust to demonstrate proper form. When enthusiasts discussed ballistics and got their calculations wrong, she would bite her tongue and continue scanning their purchases. The other employees treated her existence as background noise. Tyler Brooks, a 23-year-old floor associate, who fancied himself an expert after 2 years of weekend shooting, would often hold court near her register, regaling customers with stories of his shooting prowess, while Jessica quietly processed transactions behind him. "You see, the key to accuracy is all about trigger control," Tyler would explain to wide-eyed customers, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never been tested under pressure. "Most people don't understand the mechanics of precision shooting." Jessica would continue her work, folding receipts with military precision while listening to explanations that contained just enough truth to sound authoritative, but enough errors to make her jaw clench with suppressed frustration. Her hands, steady and sure as they counted change, carried muscle memory that Tyler couldn't imagine. The break room conversations were perhaps the most difficult to endure. During lunch, the male employees would discuss their latest range sessions. comparing groupings and debating equipment, modifications with the passion of people who had turned their hobby into their identity. Jessica would sit in the corner, eating her sandwich in silence while they talked past her as if she didn't exist. "I'm telling you, Brandon," Tyler would say to his friend from the accessories department, "if you want to improve your speed, you need to work on your reload technique. I can get a fresh magazine in my AR in under 3 seconds. Jessica had performed tactical reloads in combat conditions while under fire, her life and the lives of her teammates depending on speed that Tyler couldn't comprehend. But she would simply nod when they occasionally acknowledged her presence, maintaining the facade of someone who found their expertise impressive rather than amusing. The customers were often worse than her co-workers. Men would explain basic gun safety to her while purchasing firearms, assuming that her gender and position behind the register meant she needed education rather than possessed it. Women would ask her to fetch someone who knows about guns when they needed advice, unable to imagine that the cashier might be the most qualified person in the building. "Honey, you should probably let one of the guys handle this," an older customer told her once when she reached for a rifle he wanted to examine. "These things can be dangerous if you don't know what you're doing." Jessica had handled weapons that made his hunting rifle look like a toy, had maintained equipment that could eliminate targets at distances he couldn't imagine, had trained soldiers in weapon systems that weren't available to civilians, but she simply smiled and called Tyler over, watching as he fumbled through an explanation that contained more enthusiasm than accuracy. The irony wasn't lost on her. Eagle Point Firearms Gear was one of the largest gun retailers in Texas, serving everyone from casual hunters to serious collectors to military contractors. The walls were lined with assault rifles, precision sniper systems, tactical gear, and accessories that represented the cutting edge of firearms technology. Yet the person who understood these weapons better than anyone else in the building was assumed to know nothing about them. During slow periods, Jessica would find herself studying the customers and employees with the analytical eye that had once made her invaluable to her unit. She noticed things others missed, the way someone's stance revealed their level of training, the subtle signs that indicated whether a customer was genuinely knowledgeable or simply repeating things they'd heard online, the small details that separated professionals from enthusiasts. Her observations went into a mental notebook that she updated constantly, a habit formed during years of military service, where attention to detail could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She noted which employees gave accurate advice and which ones were potentially dangerous in their ignorance. She tracked which customers seemed to know what they were doing and which ones probably shouldn't be trusted with a cap gun. But Jessica kept these observations to herself, maintaining the quiet professionalism that had kept her employed and unremarkable for 14 months. She had learned that being underestimated was safer than being noticed. That invisibility provided a kind of protection that expertise couldn't guarantee. As closing time approached each day, Jessica would perform her assigned duties with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. Cleaning the register area, organizing receipts, restocking bags and promotional materials. Simple tasks that she completed flawlessly while her mind processed everything she had observed during the day. Craig would often find excuses to criticize her work during these final minutes, asserting his authority through petty complaints and unnecessary corrections. "Jessica, these receipt rolls aren't aligned properly. Do it again." The tasks were meaningless, but the message was clear. Know your place, stay in your lane, and don't forget that you're replaceable. Jessica would nod and make the corrections without complaint, understanding that Craig's behavior said more about his insecurities than her competence. She had served under real leaders in situations where lives hung in the balance. Craig Thompson's small-minded power games were more pathetic than threatening, but as she drove home each evening, Jessica carried the weight of her hidden identity like a physical burden. She was living a double life, playing a role that required her to suppress everything she had been trained to be. The woman who could field strip an M4 carbine blindfolded was pretending to need help, understanding basic firearms terminology. The soldier who had earned the respect of Special Forces operators was accepting dismissal from sporting goods salesmen. In her apartment, surrounded by the few mementos she had kept from her military service, Jessica would sometimes wonder if she was honoring her brother's memory through this quiet existence or betraying it. David Barnes had died believing that his sister was destined for greatness, that her skills and dedication would make a difference in the world. Instead, she was scanning barcodes and counting change while less qualified people made decisions about weapons they barely understood. The photograph of David in his Special Forces uniform seemed to watch her from the dresser, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she was trying to forget. His sacrifice had earned him a posthumous Bronze Star and a flag-draped coffin. Her sacrifice was earning her $12.50 an hour and the assumption that she knew nothing about the tools. Her brother had used to serve his country, but Jessica had chosen this path deliberately, seeking anonymity after the trauma of losing David and leaving the military had left her questioning everything she thought she knew about service and sacrifice. Eagle Point Firearms and Gear wasn't just a job. It was a test of her ability to find purpose in ordinary life, to honor her brother's memory through quiet excellence rather than public recognition. What she didn't know was that her quiet excellence was about to be tested in ways she couldn't imagine, and that the invisible cashier was about to become the most important person in the building. The skills she had spent 14 months hiding were about to save the day in spectacular fashion, proving that expertise doesn't always come in the packages people expect. Tomorrow would bring changes that would transform everything Jessica thought she knew about staying invisible. The woman who had perfected the art of being underestimated was about to discover that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is let people see who you really are. The first sign that Jessica Barnes was more than she appeared came on a rainy Tuesday morning in October, though nobody at Eagle Point Firearms and Gear was paying close enough attention to notice. A customer had brought in a malfunctioning AR-15 that had been jamming during a weekend competition, and Tyler Brooks was struggling to identify the problem while a growing line of impatient customers watched his fumbling attempts at diagnosis. "It probably just needs a good cleaning," Tyler announced with false confidence, though Jessica could see from her position at the register that he was holding the weapon awkwardly, his fingers uncertain as they probed the action. These things jam up when people don't maintain them properly. The customer, a middle-aged man wearing a shooting jacket covered in competition patches, frowned with obvious skepticism. "I clean it after every use." This started happening yesterday during the state championship qualifiers. "Cost me a chance at making the team." Jessica continued scanning ammunition purchases for other customers, but her eyes tracked every movement. As Tyler attempted to field strip the rifle, she watched him struggle with the takedown pins, his technique clumsy and inefficient. When he finally managed to separate the upper and lower receivers, he held them at odd angles, clearly uncomfortable with the weapon's mechanics. "See, there's your problem," Tyler said, pointing at the bolt carrier group with the authority of someone who had watched YouTube videos but lacked practical experience. "Carbon buildup in the gas system. Happens all the time with these military-style rifles." But Jessica could see what Tyler was missing. From 15 feet away, even with the weapon partially disassembled and held at an awkward angle, she had identified the real issue, a broken extractor spring that was causing the ejection failures. The carbon buildup Tyler was fixated on was normal operational residue, not the source of the malfunction. The broken spring was a simple part that could be replaced in minutes, but Tyler's misdiagnosis was about to cost the customer both time and money. "I'll need to order some parts and solvents," Tyler continued, warming to his role as the expert. "Should have this running like new in about a week." Going to cost maybe $150 in parts and labor. Jessica felt her jaw clench involuntarily. The actual repair required a $3 spring and 5 minutes of work. But she maintained her position behind the register, processing transactions while listening to Tyler dig himself deeper into incompetence. The competitive shooter looked increasingly frustrated. A week? I have another match this weekend. Can't anyone else take a look at it? Tyler's our best technician, Craig Thompson announced, emerging from his office with the timing of someone who enjoyed reinforcing hierarchies. If he says it needs a week, that's what it needs. These military weapons are complex machines. Jessica's hands paused imperceptibly as she counted change for a customer purchasing hunting ammunition. David had carried an M4 carbine through 3 deployments, maintaining it under conditions that would horrify the climate-controlled environment of Eagle Point. She had watched him perform field maintenance in 130-degree heat while taking sporadic fire. His hands steady and sure as he addressed malfunctions that could mean the difference between coming home and not coming home. The AR-15 platform was familiar to Jessica in ways that Tyler couldn't comprehend. She had trained on military variants, understood their mechanics at a fundamental level, could disassemble and reassemble them with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought. The weapon Tyler was struggling with was a civilian version of equipment she had mastered years ago, simplified and refined for commercial use. There's got to be someone else, the customer pressed, desperation creeping into his voice. I've been training for months for this qualification series. Craig's expression hardened. Sir, I understand your frustration, but we maintain professional standards here. Tyler has years of experience with these weapons systems. If you're not satisfied with our timeline, you're welcome to try another shop. Jessica finished with her customer and found herself making a decision that surprised her. For 14 months, she had maintained perfect invisibility, never volunteering information or contradicting the supposed experts around her. But watching a fellow competitor get misled while Tyler's ignorance masqueraded as expertise triggered something deeper than professional frustration. Excuse me, she said quietly, her voice barely carrying across the showroom floor. I might be able to help. The conversation stopped. Craig turned toward her with the expression of someone who had just heard their coffee pot offer opinions on quantum physics. Tyler looked annoyed at the interruption, while the customer seemed confused about why the cashier was inserting herself into a technical discussion. Jessica, Craig said, his tone carrying a warning, I think we can handle this without input from the register. But something in Jessica's posture had changed. The submissive body language she had cultivated for over a year was replaced by the confident stance of someone who knew exactly what they were talking about. Her eyes focused on the partially disassembled rifle with an intensity that made Tyler unconsciously step backward. The extractor spring is broken, she said, her voice gaining strength. That's why it's failing to eject spent casings. The carbon buildup is normal operational residue, not the source of the malfunction. The showroom fell silent. Tyler's mouth opened and closed without sound, while Craig stared at Jessica as if she had suddenly sprouted wings. The customer looked between them, processing this unexpected development. How could you possibly know that from over there? Tyler demanded, his authority challenged in front of witnesses. Jessica stepped away from her register, moving toward the group with measured steps. Because I can see the extractor when you hold the bolt at that angle. The spring arm is visibly damaged. She gestured toward the weapon without touching it, her hands moving with precise technical language that cut through Tyler's confused fumbling. The extractor spring provides the tension needed to grip the cartridge rim during the firing cycle. When it breaks, the spent casing doesn't get pulled from the chamber during the extraction stroke. The weapon cycles normally until the ejection phase when the broken spring fails to maintain tension. The customer leaned forward, his frustration replaced by interest. That ... actually makes sense. It was cycling fine, just not ejecting. Craig stepped between Jessica and the group, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Jessica, return to your register immediately. You're not qualified to diagnose firearms malfunctions, but the damage was done. The customer had heard a technically accurate explanation that matched his observations, contrasting sharply with Tyler's uncertain guesswork. More importantly, Jessica had revealed knowledge that didn't fit the narrative everyone had constructed about the quiet cashier, who knew nothing about guns. Where did you learn about rifle mechanics? The customer asked, ignoring Craig's attempts to redirect the conversation. Jessica hesitated, feeling the weight of 14 months of careful invisibility pressing against her desire to help a fellow shooter. The truth was complicated, involving years of military training and combat experience that she had spent over a year trying to forget. But Tyler's incompetence was about to cost this man his competitive season, and her brother's voice echoed. In her memory, when you know something that can help, Jess, you have an obligation to step forward. I used to work with similar weapons, she said carefully, the understatement of the decade delivered in a tone that suggested the conversation should end there, but Tyler wasn't willing to let his authority be undermined by someone he considered beneath his notice. Work with them how? Cleaning them at a military surplus store. The dismissive tone triggered something in Jessica that 14 months of workplace harassment hadn't touched. This wasn't about her ego or Craig's power games. This was about professional competence and a fellow competitor who needed help. David had taught her that expertise carried responsibility, and that staying silent when you could make a difference was its own form of cowardice. I was a weapons specialist in the 82nd Airborne, she said, her voice steady and calm. 3 deployments to Iraq. I maintained M4 carbines, M249 SAWs, and M240 machine guns under combat conditions. The AR-15 platform is civilian legal variant of the M4 system I worked with for 6 years. The showroom erupted in shocked silence. Craig's face cycled through disbelief, anger, and the dawning realization that he had been dismissing someone whose qualifications made his entire staff look like amateurs. Tyler stared at Jessica as if she had revealed herself to be an alien, while the customer nodded with the recognition of someone who finally understood what he was seeing. Son of a bitch, the customer said quietly. No wonder you spotted the problem. Can you fix it? Craig stepped forward, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. She is not authorized to perform repairs on customer weapons. Store policy is very clear about who can. Actually, the customer interrupted. I'm not asking for an official repair. I'm asking someone who knows what they're talking about to confirm what's wrong with my rifle. Jessica looked at the weapon, then at the faces surrounding her. She had spent 14 months hiding her capabilities, accepting dismissal and condescension from people who couldn't perform basic functions she had mastered years ago. But this moment felt different, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing that the only way forward was to step into open air. If you want a second opinion, she said quietly, I'd be happy to take a look. What happened next would change everything. Jessica thought she knew about staying invisible. The weapon in Tyler's hands was about to become the key that unlocked 14 months of hidden expertise. And the quiet cashier was about to prove that the most dangerous assumption in any workplace is underestimating the person everyone considers least important. The storm she had been avoiding was about to begin, and Jessica Barnes was finally ready to let people see who she really was. The revelation that Eagle Point's quiet cashier was a combat veteran sent shockwaves through the store that lasted exactly until closing time. By the next morning, the initial surprise had transformed into something far more toxic, systematic. Mockery designed to put Jessica Barnes back in what Craig Thompson considered her proper place. Well, Tyler Brooks announced as Jessica clocked in Wednesday morning, his voice carrying across the showroom with theatrical volume. "Look who thinks she's G.I. Jane. Hope you're ready for another day of advanced register operations. Sergeant Barnes." The emphasis on her former rank was deliberate, delivered with the sneering tone reserved for people who Tyler believed were getting above themselves. He had spent the previous evening researching military ranks online, arming himself with just enough knowledge to weaponize his ignorance effectively. Craig Thompson emerged from his office with the satisfied expression of someone who had spent considerable time planning his approach to this problem. In his mind, Jessica's revelation wasn't an asset to be leveraged, but a threat to be neutralized. She had embarrassed his best technician in front of a customer, challenged the established hierarchy, and made everyone question competencies they had taken for granted. "Jessica," Craig called out, his voice echoing with artificial authority. "Since you're apparently such an expert on military weapons, I've got some special assignments for you today." He handed her a clipboard with a task list that made his intentions immediately clear. She was to clean every rifle in the used gun section, organize the ammunition storage room by grain weight and manufacturer, and inventory every scope and optic in the store. The work was legitimate but tedious, designed to keep her away from customers while demonstrating that technical knowledge didn't change her position in the workplace hierarchy. "I want every serial number recorded, every piece of glass polished to perfection, and every cartridge counted twice," Craig continued, his tone suggesting he was doing her a favor by giving her such important responsibilities. "Since you understand these weapons so well, I'm sure you'll appreciate the attention to detail required." Jessica accepted the clipboard without complaint, recognizing the punishment for what it was. But as she began her assigned tasks, she noticed that her revelation had created an invisible divide among the staff. Some employees watched her with newfound respect, while others seemed threatened by the idea that the person they had dismissed might know more than they did. Mike Collins, the assistant manager who had always treated her with basic courtesy, approached while she was cataloging rifle serial numbers in the back storage area. At 35, Mike was a former police officer who had left law enforcement after a shooting incident left him questioning his career choice. Unlike Craig and Tyler, he had actual experience with firearms in life-or-death situations. "So, 82nd Airborne," he said quietly, settling into a chair beside her workstation. "That's no joke. How many deployments?" "3, Jessica replied, continuing her inventory work while they talked. "Mosul, Ramadi, and Fallujah. Weapons maintenance specialist attached to various units as needed." Mike nodded with the understanding of someone who recognized the weight those place names carried. "That explains a lot. I was wondering how you spotted that extractor spring issue from across the room. Most people wouldn't know what to look for." "Pattern recognition," Jessica said simply. "When you've seen the same malfunction 100 times under pressure, you learn to identify it quickly." Their conversation was interrupted by Tyler's voice carrying from the showroom, where he was holding court with a group of customers who had come in for hunting supplies. His voice was deliberately loud, designed to ensure Jessica could hear every word. "The thing about military training," Tyler announced with the authority of someone who had never worn a uniform, "is that it's all about following orders, not thinking for yourself. They teach you to maintain weapons by the book, but they don't teach you to understand why things work the way they do." Jessica's hands stilled on the rifle she was examining, a bolt-action hunting rifle that some customer had traded in after deciding they needed something with more range. Tyler's commentary was factually wrong on multiple levels, but she had learned that correcting him would only escalate the situation. "I mean, cleaning rifles and following maintenance schedules is fine for the military," Tyler continued, warming to his theme, "but civilian shooting requires real expertise. Understanding ballistics, choosing the right ammunition for specific applications, customizing weapons for individual needs." That's technical knowledge you can't get from a military manual. Mike rolled his eyes and returned to his own work, clearly disgusted by Tyler's performance. But other employees were listening, and Jessica could see some of them nodding along with Tyler's explanation. The narrative he was constructing was designed to minimize her expertise while elevating his own, suggesting that military experience was somehow less valuable than his sporting goods education. The mockery intensified. Throughout the morning, Brandon Walsh from Accessories made pointed comments about weekend warriors who thought their training made them experts. Ashley Kim, one of the other cashiers, began asking Jessica exaggerated questions about military life, her tone suggesting she found the whole thing amusing rather than impressive. "So Jessica," Ashley said during their lunch break, "did you ever actually see combat, or were you just cleaning rifles in some safe base somewhere?" The question hit Jessica like a physical blow. The assumption that her service had been comfortable and safe revealed how little civilians understood about what deployment actually meant, especially for someone in her role. Weapons specialists weren't rear echelon personnel. They were embedded with combat units, maintaining equipment under fire, ensuring that soldiers' lives weren't lost to mechanical failures. "I was attached to infantry units," Jessica replied. Quietly, wherever they went, I went. But Ashley had already lost interest, turning her attention to her phone and dismissing Jessica's response as unimportant. The casual disregard stung more than outright hostility, suggesting that her service was considered routine rather than significant. Craig's approach was more systematically cruel. Throughout the day, he found excuses to interrupt Jessica's work, checking her progress with the excessive scrutiny of someone looking for mistakes. When she completed the ammunition inventory ahead of schedule, he assigned additional tasks. When she finished those, he found problems with her earlier work that required starting over. "These serial numbers aren't aligned properly," he announced, reviewing her rifle inventory with exaggerated disappointment. "Military precision should include attention to presentation, don't you think?" Jessica looked at the perfectly legible, properly recorded serial numbers and understood that Craig wasn't interested in actual quality. He was establishing dominance, demonstrating that her expertise didn't protect her from his authority. She redid the work without complaint, maintaining the professional bearing that had gotten her through far worse situations. The customers were perhaps the most difficult to endure. Word had spread about the previous day's incident, and several people came in specifically to test the veteran cashier with questions and challenges. Some were genuinely curious, but others seemed to view her as entertainment, a novelty act they could poke and prod for their amusement. "So, soldier girl," an older man said while purchasing ammunition, "I bet you think you know more about guns than us civilians, huh?" Jessica processed his transaction professionally, but she could feel his expectation that she would either boast about her knowledge or retreat into defensive explanations. Either response would feed into the narrative that she was either arrogant or insecure about her background. "I know what I know," she replied simply, handing him his receipt. "Just like everyone else." But her diplomatic responses only seemed to encourage more questions, more challenges, more attempts to define her service in terms that diminished its significance. By mid-afternoon, Jessica felt like a zoo animal being observed by visitors who couldn't decide whether she was dangerous or just interesting. The breaking point came when a customer brought in a rifle for cleaning and specifically requested that the military girl handle it. Despite Craig's attempts to direct the business to Tyler, the customer, a retired Marine, wanted to compare his service experiences with hers, and he wasn't willing to accept substitutes. "Listen, son," he told Tyler firmly, "I've been shooting since before you were born, and I want someone who understands military weapons to work on my rifle. That young lady over there has the qualifications I'm looking for." Craig's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Having a customer explicitly reject his chosen technician in favor of his cashier represented exactly the kind of hierarchy disruption he had been trying to prevent. But with the customer insisting and other people watching, he had no choice but to allow Jessica to examine the rifle. Jessica approached the situation carefully, understanding that this moment would either establish her credibility or provide ammunition for her critics. The rifle was a military surplus M1 Garand that had been converted for civilian use, a weapon she knew intimately from her training and historical study. "Beautiful rifle," she said, accepting the weapon with the respect it deserved. These were the standard infantry weapon through World War II and Korea. Still one of the most reliable semi-automatic rifles ever manufactured, the retired Marine beamed with pride, recognizing that he was talking to someone who understood the weapon's significance. But Tyler and Craig watched with barely concealed hostility as Jessica demonstrated knowledge that made their sporting goods expertise look superficial by comparison. What they didn't understand was that Jessica's revelation had only scratched the surface of her capabilities. The woman who had identified a broken extractor spring from across the room was hiding skills that would make their mockery look like the desperate posturing of people who had never been tested under real pressure. Storm of ridicule they had unleashed was about to become something much more dangerous for everyone involved. Jessica Barnes was tired of being underestimated, and she was about to demonstrate why assumptions about quiet people can be the most expensive mistakes you ever make. The next few days would test everything she thought she knew about staying invisible, and Craig Thompson was about to learn that humiliating a combat veteran might not be the career-advancing strategy he imagined. While Craig Thompson and Tyler Brooks continued their campaign of workplace harassment, Jessica Barnes was doing what came naturally to her, observing, analyzing, and quietly documenting everything that happened around her. The skills that had kept her alive in combat zones weren't limited to weapon maintenance. They included the ability to read people, assess threats, and identify weaknesses that others missed. During her 2 weeks of intensified scrutiny and additional duties, Jessica had inadvertently gained access to parts of Eagle Point's operation that she had never seen before. Craig's punishment assignments had taken her into storage areas, administrative offices, and behind-the-scenes spaces where the real business of the store was conducted. What she discovered there painted a troubling picture of incompetence that extended far beyond Tyler's fumbling with customer repairs. The ammunition storage room, which she had been ordered to organize and inventory, revealed discrepancies that would have horrified any competent manager. Serial numbers for restricted items didn't match the bound book entries required by federal law. Inventory counts were wildly inaccurate, with some popular calibers showing negative stock numbers that indicated either theft or record-keeping failures that could trigger ATF investigations. Jessica documented these discrepancies methodically, not out of vindictiveness, but because her military training had ingrained habits of accuracy and accountability that she couldn't simply turn off. Every misplaced box of ammunition, every incorrectly logged firearm transfer, every safety violation she observed went into a mental catalog that grew more concerning each day. The scope and optics inventory revealed even more troubling issues. Expensive items were stored without proper security measures. Serial numbers were recorded incorrectly or not at all, and several high-end scopes showed signs of damage that suggested poor handling or inadequate storage conditions. For a store that prided itself on serving serious shooters and military contractors, the casual approach to valuable inventory represented both financial risk and potential legal liability. But it was her observation of customer interactions that provided the most damning evidence of Eagle Point's problems. From her new vantage point, organizing storage areas adjacent to the sales floor, Jessica could overhear conversations between employees and customers without being seen. What she heard would have shocked any responsible business owner. Tyler Brooks regularly provided factually incorrect information about ammunition ballistics, weapon modifications, and safety procedures. His confident delivery masked fundamental misunderstandings that could lead to equipment damage or personal injury. When customers asked technical questions beyond his knowledge, Tyler would improvise answers rather than admit ignorance or seek help from more knowledgeable sources. "Sure, you can use those plus P loads in any 9mm pistol," she heard him tell a customer who was asking about high-pressure ammunition for an older firearm. "The plus P just means they're more powerful. Your gun can handle it, no problem." Jessica knew that plus P ammunition generated significantly higher chamber pressures that could damage older firearms not designed for such loads. The customer's pistol, which she had glimpsed during the conversation, appeared to be a vintage model that could be seriously damaged or rendered unsafe by Tyler's recommendation. But intervening would only escalate her conflict with Craig and potentially cost her the job she needed to maintain her low profile. Brandon Walsh from the accessories department was equally problematic, selling customers expensive modifications and add-ons that they didn't need while failing to address actual requirements they had expressed. His sales technique focused on maximizing transaction value rather than matching customers with appropriate equipment, an approach that generated short-term revenue while building long-term dissatisfaction. Even more concerning were the instances where employees provided advice that could create legal problems for customers. Jessica overheard discussions about firearm modifications that might violate federal regulations, accessory combinations that could reclassify weapons under a TF guidelines, and transportation advice that ignored state-specific laws. The potential liability these conversations created was staggering. Yet none of the employees seemed aware of the legal minefield they were navigating. Craig's management style compounded these problems by discouraging questions and punishing employees who admitted uncertainty. The culture he had created incentivized confident ignorance over careful accuracy, leading to a situation where customers received authoritative-sounding advice that was often dangerously wrong. "Never let customers think you don't know something," Jessica overheard Craig telling Ashley Kim during a break room conversation. "If they lose confidence in your expertise, they'll take their business somewhere else. Better to give them an answer that sounds right than to admit you're not sure." This philosophy violated everything Jessica had learned about professional responsibility during her military service. In combat situations, admitting uncertainty could save lives, while false confidence could get people killed. The same principles applied to civilian firearms advice, where incorrect information could lead to equipment failures, accidents, or legal problems that destroyed people's lives. Jessica's observations extended beyond technical incompetence to include questionable business practices that suggested either negligence or deliberate misconduct. She noticed patterns in how certain transactions were recorded, discrepancies between cash sales and register entries, and inventory movements that didn't appear in official records. Whether these represented simple mistakes or intentional fraud, they created exposure that could destroy the business if discovered by regulatory authorities. The irony wasn't lost on her that Craig's punishment assignments had inadvertently given her a comprehensive view of Eagle Point's operational weaknesses. While he intended to humiliate her with menial tasks, he had actually provided her with intelligence that revealed the store's vulnerabilities more clearly than any external audit could have accomplished. During quiet moments between tasks, Jessica found herself mentally composing the report she would write if Eagle Point were a military facility under her inspection. The findings would be devastating: systematic failures in inventory control, widespread safety violations, inadequate employee training, and management practices that prioritized appearance over competence. Any commanding officer receiving such a report would initiate immediate corrective action and probably relieve several people of their duties. But Eagle Point wasn't a military facility, and Jessica wasn't an inspector. She was a cashier trying to maintain a low profile while dealing with workplace harassment that seemed designed to drive her away. The knowledge she was accumulating felt like a burden rather than an advantage, especially when she was powerless to address the problems she was documenting. Mike Collins seemed to sense her frustration during one of their brief conversations. "In the storage area, you're seeing things that bother you, aren't you?" he asked quietly, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. Jessica paused in her inventory work, considering how much to reveal. Mike had been consistently supportive, but she couldn't be certain that anything she said wouldn't eventually reach Craig's ears. "There are some discrepancies in the records," she said carefully. "Nothing that affects my assigned duties, just things I've noticed while organizing." Mike nodded grimly. "I've been worried about some of the same issues." Craig's approach to management creates problems that he doesn't want to acknowledge. The question is whether anyone will listen to concerns from employees he considers expendable. The comment highlighted Jessica's dilemma. She possessed knowledge and expertise that could benefit Eagle Point's operation, but the very people who most needed to hear her insights were the ones most invested in dismissing her input. Craig had made it clear that her military background was a liability rather than an asset, while Tyler viewed her competence as a threat to his position. "Sometimes the best thing you can do is document everything and wait for the right moment," Mike suggested, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned patience through difficult experience. "People like Craig and Tyler create their own problems eventually. When that happens, having accurate information becomes very valuable." Jessica understood the wisdom in his advice, but waiting felt like complicity when she could see problems that endangered both customers and employees. Her military training had emphasized proactive problem-solving and personal accountability, values that conflicted with the passive approach that workplace survival sometimes required. As she continued her assigned tasks over the following days, Jessica maintained her methodical documentation while observing the personalities and motivations that drove Eagle Point's dysfunction. Craig's insecurity manifested as authoritarian control, Tyler's incompetence hid behind aggressive confidence, and Brandon's greed overshadowed any concern for customer welfare. The pattern was familiar from her military experience: weak leadership, creating conditions where dangerous mistakes became inevitable. The only question was whether the reckoning would come from external authorities, customer complaints, or internal failures that could no longer be ignored. What Jessica didn't know was that the moment Mike had referenced was approaching faster than anyone expected. Eagle Point was about to face a test that would expose every weakness she had observed, and the quiet cashier who had been documenting their failures was about to become the most important person in the building. The storm she had been watching build was about to break, and everyone was about to discover that the woman they had dismissed was the only one prepared for what was coming. The call that would change everything at Eagle Point Firearms Gear came on a Thursday morning in November, just as Jessica Barnes was beginning her third week of intensified harassment. Craig Thompson answered his office phone with his usual brusque greeting, but his tone quickly shifted to something approaching panic as he listened to the voice on the other end. "Yes, ma'am." "Absolutely. District Manager Reed. Of course we can accommodate a full operational assessment. When did you say you'd be arriving?" Jessica continued organizing ammunition displays near Craig's office, but she couldn't help overhearing the conversation that was making her boss increasingly agitated. The phrases corporate inspection, customer complaints, and regulatory compliance review carried clearly through the thin office walls, each one seeming to drain more color from Craig's face. "Next Tuesday? That's very short notice." "Ma'am, yes, I understand the urgency. We'll be ready for your visit. Absolutely. Everything will be in perfect order." Craig hung up the phone and sat in stunned silence for several moments before the implications of the call hit him like a freight train. Amanda Reed, the district manager who controlled his career prospects and the store's operational status, was coming for an unscheduled inspection that could result in anything from mandated improvements to complete management restructuring within minutes. Craig burst from his office like a man whose hair was on fire, his usual authoritarian swagger replaced by barely controlled desperation. The confident manager who had spent weeks humiliating Jessica suddenly looked like someone facing the end of his career. All hands meeting in the break room now. He shouted, his voice carrying across the entire store. "Drop whatever you're doing and get back there immediately." Jessica joined the gathering of confused employees, noting how Craig's demeanor had shifted from petty tyrant to panicked middle manager. Tyler Brooks looked nervous, probably sensing that his technical incompetence might finally face scrutiny from someone with actual authority. Brandon Walsh appeared concerned about his sales practices, while Mike Collins maintained the calm expression of someone who had been expecting this development for months. "We have a situation," Craig announced, trying to project confidence he clearly didn't feel. "District Manager Reed will be conducting a comprehensive operational review next Tuesday. This is a routine inspection, nothing to worry about, but we need to make sure everything is absolutely perfect." Jessica almost smiled at the word routine. In her experience, unscheduled inspections were never routine, and the panic in Craig's voice suggested he understood the stakes better than he was admitting to his staff. "Tyler, I need you to double-check every repair work order from the past 6 months. Make sure all documentation is complete and filed properly. Brandon, review all your sales transactions and ensure every accessory recommendation is properly justified. Ashley, organize all the register receipts and make sure cash reconciliation is perfect for the last quarter." The assignments continued, each one revealing Craig's awareness of potential problems that could destroy his career if discovered. But as Jessica listened to the frantic delegation of responsibility, she realized that Craig was addressing symptoms rather than underlying issues. The fundamental problems she had observed during her punishment assignments couldn't be fixed with last-minute paperwork and surface-level organization. "Jessica," Craig said, his tone carrying a desperate edge that hadn't been there during previous interactions, "I need you to handle the inventory verification for all restricted items. Make sure every serial number matches our bound book entries, and if there are any discrepancies, I need to know about them immediately." The irony was staggering. The man who had spent weeks dismissing her expertise and assigning her menial tasks was now entrusting her with the most critical aspect of regulatory compliance. Jessica understood that Craig's sudden confidence in her abilities stemmed from desperation rather than recognition, but she also realized that his panic had created an opportunity she hadn't expected. "I'll need access to all storage areas and administrative records," she said carefully, testing the boundaries of her new temporary authority. "Whatever you need," Craig replied without hesitation. "Mike will provide you with keys and passwords. Just get me a complete assessment by Monday morning." As the meeting dispersed, Jessica found herself in the surreal position of being Eagle Point's most important employee, despite remaining their least respected one. Craig's crisis had temporarily suspended the normal workplace hierarchy, creating a window where her competence mattered more than her position on the organizational chart. Mike Collins approached her as other employees scattered to their assignments. "This is what I was talking about," he said quietly. "When the moment comes, having accurate information becomes very valuable." Jessica nodded, understanding that she was about to gain access to information that could either save Eagle Point or provide the evidence needed to justify whatever action District Manager Reed was contemplating. The question was whether Craig's sudden reliance on her abilities would survive the immediate crisis or evaporate once the inspection was over. Over the next few days, Jessica threw herself into the inventory verification with the systematic thoroughness that had made her valuable to military units under pressure. What she discovered was worse than her earlier observations had suggested. The discrepancies weren't just clerical errors or minor oversights. They represented systematic failures that could trigger federal investigations and potentially criminal charges. Serial numbers for dozens of firearms had been recorded incorrectly or omitted entirely from required documentation. Inventory counts for restricted ammunition were off by thousands of rounds, suggesting either massive theft or record-keeping failures that violated federal regulations. Transfer documents for several high-end rifles contained obvious forgeries, or alterations that could indicate straw purchases or other illegal activities. Most concerning were the gaps in the bound book entries that documented every firearm transaction. Federal law required these records to be maintained with absolute accuracy, but Jessica found missing pages, altered entries, and serial numbers that appeared in multiple locations with different associated information. Any ATF inspector would immediately recognize these as indicators of serious violations that could result in license revocation and criminal prosecution. Tyler's repair records were equally problematic. Work orders lacked proper documentation of parts replaced, modifications performed, or safety inspections completed. Several weapons showed signs of amateur gunsmithing that could affect their legal classification under federal regulations. Most damaging were instances where Tyler had apparently performed modifications without proper documentation, creating weapons that might violate assault weapon laws or other regulatory restrictions. Brandon's sales practices had created their own legal minefield. Jessica found records indicating that he had sold combination of accessories that could constitute illegal weapon modifications, provided advice that encouraged regulatory violations, and failed to properly document transactions that required additional scrutiny. His focus on maximizing sales had led him to ignore compliance requirements that could expose both customers and the store to serious legal problems. As Jessica compiled her findings, she realized that District Manager Reed's visit wasn't just a routine inspection. Someone had filed complaints serious enough to trigger corporate intervention, and the evidence Jessica was uncovering suggested those complaints were well-founded. Eagle Point was facing an existential crisis that could destroy the business and end several careers. The weight of this knowledge pressed on Jessica as she worked through the weekend, cross-referencing documents and building a comprehensive picture of Eagle Point's operational failures. She had the power to either help Craig navigate the coming inspection or provide Reed with evidence that would justify drastic action. The choice would depend on how Craig and his team treated her once the immediate crisis passed. Monday morning arrived with the oppressive atmosphere of a unit preparing for combat. Craig paced the store like a caged animal, second-guessing every decision and demanding constant updates from his staff. Tyler worked frantically to address problems in his repair documentation, while Brandon attempted to justify sales practices that looked increasingly questionable under scrutiny. "Where's my inventory report?" Craig demanded as Jessica arrived for her shift. "Reed will be here first thing tomorrow morning, and I need to know exactly what we're dealing with." Jessica handed him a folder containing her findings, watching his face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and growing horror as he read her documentation. The scope of the problems was far worse than he had imagined, and the evidence she had compiled painted a picture of systematic negligence that could end his career. "This can't be right," he said weakly, flipping through pages of documented violations and discrepancies. "These numbers ... these problems. How did this happen?" Jessica looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who had spent weeks observing the exact behaviors that created these problems. "This is what happens when competence takes a back seat to confidence," she said quietly. "When people are more concerned with appearing knowledgeable than actually being knowledgeable." Craig stared at her, finally understanding that the woman he had dismissed and humiliated was the only person in the building capable of helping him survive what was coming. The quiet cashier who knew nothing about guns was about to become his lifeline in a crisis that threatened everything he had worked to build. Tomorrow would bring District Manager Reed, and a reckoning that would test every assumption Eagle Point had made about expertise, authority, and the value of quiet competence. The woman they had called just a cashier was about to prove that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one everyone thinks matters least. Mike Collins had been watching Jessica Barnes more carefully than anyone realized, and Craig Thompson's desperate reliance on her expertise confirmed suspicions that had been building for weeks. As the assistant manager with actual law enforcement experience, Mike possessed the background necessary to recognize competence when he saw it. Regardless of the package it came in. Tuesday morning arrived with the tension of a military base expecting enemy contact. District Manager Amanda Reed was scheduled to arrive at 10 a.m. for what Craig had euphemistically described to his staff as a routine operational review. But Mike knew better. Unscheduled corporate inspections triggered by customer complaints were never routine, and the panic in Craig's behavior suggested he understood the existential nature of the threat they were facing. "Jessica," Mike said quietly as she prepared for another day of inventory verification, "we need to talk before Reed arrives. Can you spare 15 minutes? Jessica looked up from the documentation she had been organizing, noting the serious expression on Mike's face. Over the past few weeks, he had been her only source of workplace support, treating her with the professional respect that everyone else seemed incapable of providing. "Of course. Is there a problem with my inventory report?" Mike glanced around the store, ensuring that Craig and Tyler were occupied with their own crisis preparations before responding. "The problem isn't with your report. The problem is that your report reveals issues that could destroy this business, and I'm starting to understand why." He gestured toward the break room, which would provide privacy for a conversation that could determine how the next few hours unfolded. Jessica followed him, carrying the folder that contained enough evidence to end several careers and potentially trigger federal investigations. "I've been a cop for 12 years before coming here," Mike began once they were seated away from potential eavesdroppers. "I know what systematic failures look like, and I know what happens when incompetent people are given authority over things they don't understand." Jessica remained silent, uncertain about how much she should reveal about her observations and conclusions. Mike had been supportive, but she couldn't be sure that her honesty wouldn't eventually reach Craig's ears and make her situation even more precarious. "The inventory discrepancies you've documented aren't just clerical errors," Mike continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had investigated similar cases during his law enforcement career. "Some of these patterns suggest deliberate misconduct. Others indicate negligence so systematic that it might as well be intentional." He opened the folder Jessica had prepared, pointing to specific entries that had caught his attention. "These serial number discrepancies? In a federal investigation, these would be considered indicators of possible straw purchases or illegal trafficking. The missing bound book pages? That's a federal felony if it's determined to be intentional. The undocumented modifications Tyler has been performing? Those could reclassify weapons in ways that violate assault weapon laws." Jessica felt a chill as Mike laid out the legal implications of problems she had identified through systematic observation. Her military training had taught her to document discrepancies and report problems through proper channels, but she hadn't fully considered the criminal justice ramifications of what she had discovered. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked quietly. Mike leaned back in his chair, studying her with the analytical gaze of someone who had spent years reading people in high-stress situations. "Because I think you understand these problems better than anyone else in this building, and I think you have the background to help us navigate what's coming." He paused, then asked the question that Jessica had been expecting and dreading in equal measure. "What's your real story, Jessica? And don't give me the standard line about being a weapons specialist. Your knowledge goes deeper than basic maintenance, and your observational skills are too sharp for someone who just followed manual procedures." Jessica considered her options carefully. Mike's law enforcement background meant he would likely verify anything she told him, but his supportive behavior suggested he might be trustworthy enough to handle the complete truth about her military service and current situation. "I wasn't just a weapons specialist," she said finally. "I was an advanced marksmanship instructor and technical specialist attached to special operations units. My job was to maintain weapon systems under combat conditions and train personnel in advanced techniques that weren't covered in standard manuals." Mike nodded, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "That explains why you spotted the extractor spring problem from across the room. That explains why your inventory work is more thorough than anything we've seen from employees with years of experience. That explains why you've been documenting problems that everyone else has been ignoring." Jessica felt a mixture of relief and apprehension as she revealed information she had kept hidden for 14 months. "My brother David was Special Forces. He was killed in action 3 years ago, and I left the military shortly afterward. I came here because I needed work and wanted to stay connected to the firearms community, but I never intended to get involved in technical operations. Until Craig's incompetence forced your hand," Mike concluded. "You've been watching this place fall apart for over a year, documenting problems that could have been prevented if anyone had been paying attention to the person who actually knew what she was talking about." The conversation was interrupted by Craig's voice echoing across the store, sharp with panic and authority. "Mike, Jessica, get out here now. Reed just pulled into the parking lot, and I need everyone looking professional." As they prepared to return to the showroom, Mike placed a hand on Jessica's shoulder. "Whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to know that I understand what you've been dealing with here. Craig and Tyler have been dismissing expertise they desperately needed, and now they're about to face the consequences." Jessica gathered her documentation, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with possessing information that could determine Eagle Point's future. "What do you think Reed is going to find?" Mike's expression was grim. "I think she's going to find exactly what you've documented. A business that's been operating on borrowed time, managed by people who prioritize appearance over competence. The question is whether we can help them understand the problems before those problems destroy everything." As they walked back toward the showroom, Jessica realized that Mike's recognition of her capabilities represented more than just personal validation. For the first time since revealing her military background, she had found someone who understood both the scope of Eagle Point's problems and her potential role in addressing them. District Manager Amanda Reed was walking through the front door. As they emerged from the break room, her professional demeanor and sharp eyes suggesting someone who had conducted enough inspections to recognize problems quickly. At 45, she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had earned her position through competence rather than politics, and her initial scan of the store suggested she was already forming preliminary assessments. "Mr. Thompson," she said, extending her hand to Craig with the professional courtesy that contained no warmth. "Thank you for accommodating this inspection on short notice. I trust your team is prepared to demonstrate Eagle Point's commitment to operational excellence." Craig's response was a mixture of nervous energy and false confidence that fooled no one. "Absolutely, Ms. Reed. We're proud of our operation here, and we're confident you'll find everything in perfect order." Jessica watched the interaction with the analytical eye she had developed through years of observing military inspections. Reed's body language suggested skepticism, while Craig's overcompensation indicated awareness of problems he was hoping to conceal. The dynamic reminded her of commanders who tried to hide unit deficiencies from visiting generals, an approach that usually made problems more obvious rather than less. "I'd like to begin with a review of your inventory control procedures," Reed announced, her tone suggesting this wasn't a request. "Specifically, I want to examine your bound book entries and cross-reference them with physical inventory." Craig's face went pale as he realized that Reed was starting with exactly the area where Jessica's report had identified the most serious problems. The documentation that could save his career or end it was sitting in Jessica's folder, and he was about to discover whether the woman he had dismissed and humiliated was willing to help him survive the most important day of his professional life. The moment of truth was approaching, and everyone was about to learn whether quiet competence would triumph over loud incompetence, or whether Eagle Point Firearms and Gear was about to become another casualty of poor leadership and misplaced priorities. Amanda Reed's inspection began with the methodical precision of someone who had dismantled dozens of failing operations, and within the first hour, it became clear that Eagle Point Firearms and Gear was facing an existential crisis that no amount of last-minute preparation could conceal. "Mr. Thompson," Reed said, her voice carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon identifying cancer, "your bound book entries for the past 6 months show discrepancies that suggest either systematic record-keeping failures or deliberate misconduct. Can you explain why 17 firearms have serial numbers that don't match their corresponding ATF Form 4473 documentation?" Craig's face cycled through confusion, panic, and desperate calculation as he realized that Reed had identified problems within minutes that his staff had been ignoring for months. Tyler Brooks stood beside him, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the deer-in-headlights expression of someone who understood that his technical incompetence was about to be exposed to someone with actual authority. "There might be some clerical errors," Craig stammered, his voice lacking any trace of the authority he had wielded so casually over his employees. "These bound books contain thousands of entries, and occasionally there are minor mistakes in transcription." Reed's expression suggested she had heard this excuse before and found it unimpressive. "Minor mistakes in federal documentation aren't acceptable, Mr. Thompson. Each discrepancy represents a potential violation that could result in license revocation and criminal prosecution." Jessica watched the exchange from her position near the inventory storage area, holding the folder that contained documentation of every problem Reed was discovering. The systematic failures she had identified during her punishment assignments were now being exposed by someone with the authority to act on them, and Craig's panic was becoming more apparent with each question. "I'd like to examine your repair and modification records next," Reed announced, turning her attention toward Tyler. "Specifically, I want to understand your documentation procedures for gunsmithing work and custom modifications." Tyler's confidence evaporated completely as he led Reed toward his workstation, where evidence of his incompetence was displayed like exhibits in a criminal trial. Work orders with missing documentation, modified weapons without proper paperwork, and repair jobs that violated basic safety protocols created a tableau of professional negligence that would horrify any competent inspector. "This AR-15, Reed said, pointing to a rifle Tyler had been working on, "appears to have been modified with a shorter barrel and collapsible stock. Do you have the ATF Form 1 documentation for this short-barreled rifle conversion?" Tyler's mouth opened and closed without sound as he realized he had no idea what Reed was talking about. The legal requirements for modifying rifles into restricted configurations were completely outside his knowledge base, despite the fact that such work comprised a significant portion of his duties. We don't usually deal with those kinds of forms," Tyler said weakly. "This was just a standard customization job." Reed's pen moved across her inspection notes with the steady rhythm of someone documenting evidence for a federal case. "Mr. Brooks, any barrel shorter than 16 inches on a rifle requires federal registration and tax payment under the National Firearms Act. What you've described as standard customization is actually illegal manufacture of a restricted weapon." The silence that followed was deafening. Craig stared at Tyler with the horrified expression of someone watching his career explode in real time, while Tyler seemed to be processing the possibility that his ignorance might have created criminal liability for both himself and the store. "How many similar modifications have you performed?" Reed asked, her tone suggesting she already suspected the answer would be devastating. Tyler looked around desperately, as if hoping someone else would answer the question for him. I'm not sure. Maybe a dozen over the past year? Reed's pen continued its methodical documentation. I'll need complete records for every modification you've performed, including customer information and current weapon locations. We're looking at potential federal violations that will require immediate ATF notification. As the inspection continued, Jessica found herself in the surreal position of watching problems she had identified weeks ago being discovered by someone with the power to shut down the entire operation. Reed's systematic approach was exposing every weakness Jessica had documented, from inventory discrepancies to safety violations to regulatory failures that could trigger criminal investigations. Mike Collins approached Jessica during a brief lull in the inspection, his expression grim with understanding. "She's finding everything you documented, isn't she?" Jessica nodded, feeling the weight of knowledge that could either save Eagle Point or provide the final evidence needed to justify its closure. Every discrepancy, every violation, every shortcut. That seemed harmless until someone with expertise examined it. "Craig's going to need help," Mike said quietly. "Reed isn't here to destroy the business, but she can't ignore violations this serious. Someone needs to demonstrate that Eagle Point has the capability to address these problems." The implication was clear. Jessica possessed both the technical knowledge and documented evidence necessary to help Reed understand the scope of the problems and the steps required to correct them. But doing so would require her to abandon the invisibility she had maintained for 14 months and accept responsibility for an operation that had dismissed her expertise until it became desperately needed. The decision point arrived when Reed called for a comprehensive inventory verification that would determine whether Eagle Point's federal firearms license could be maintained. "I need every restricted item physically located and cross-referenced with documentation," she announced. "Any discrepancies will be reported to a TF for investigation." Craig turned toward Jessica with the desperate expression of someone whose career depended on the competence of the person he had spent months humiliating. "Jessica, you know our inventory better than anyone. Can you handle the verification for Ms. Reed?" The request was delivered with none of the condescension that had characterized Craig's previous interactions with her. Desperation had temporarily suspended the workplace hierarchy that had kept Jessica's expertise marginalized, creating a moment where her knowledge mattered more than her position on the organizational chart. Reed looked at Jessica with professional interest, noting the confidence in her bearing that contrasted sharply with the nervous energy radiating from Craig and Tyler. "What's your background with firearms inventory, Ms. Barnes?" Jessica replied, accepting the moment that would either establish her credibility or expose her to ridicule from someone whose opinion actually mattered. "I have extensive experience with military weapon systems and federal documentation requirements." Reed's eyebrows rose slightly. "Military experience?" 82nd Airborne Division, weapons specialist. 3 combat deployments, advanced marksmanship, instructor certification, special operations support. The transformation in Reed's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The clinical inspector was replaced by someone who recognized genuine expertise when she encountered it. "Ms. Barnes, I'd like you to walk me through your assessment of Eagle Point's inventory control procedures." Jessica felt the familiar calm that had always preceded important missions during her military service. This wasn't about workplace politics or personal vindication. This was about demonstrating competence under pressure when the stakes were highest. She opened her folder and began presenting the documentation that would determine Eagle Point's fate. "Based on my review of the past 6 months' records," she began, her voice steady and professional, "I've identified systematic failures in several critical areas that require immediate attention." As Jessica laid out her findings with military precision, Reed took notes with the attention of someone who finally understood what she was dealing with. The quiet cashier who had been dismissed by her colleagues was demonstrating expertise that made Eagle Point's other employees look like amateurs, and Reed was taking notice. But the real test was yet to come. Reed had one final challenge that would determine whether Eagle Point had the capability to survive this crisis. And Jessica was about to discover that all her documentation and expertise had been preparing her for a moment that would change everything she thought she knew about staying invisible. The woman they had called just a cashier was about to face a test that would prove whether quiet competence could triumph over loud incompetence, or whether Eagle Point was destined to become another casualty of poor leadership and misplaced priorities. Amanda Reed's final challenge came without warning, delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had just identified the definitive test that would determine Eagle Point's fate. "Miss Barnes," she said, closing her inspection notebook. With a decisive snap, "I need to see a practical demonstration of technical competence that proves this facility has the capability to safely handle the responsibilities of a federal firearms license." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica felt the familiar premonition. Calm settled over her as she realized that everything she had observed, documented, and endured over the past 14 months had been leading to this moment. Reed wasn't just asking for another inventory check or paperwork review. She was demanding proof that someone at Eagle Point possessed the competence necessary to justify the store's continued operation. "What kind of demonstration?" Jessica asked, though she suspected she already knew what Reed had in mind. Reed gestured toward a collection of disassembled firearms that Tyler had been attempting to repair, their components scattered across the workbench in various states of incompletion. "I want to see complete disassembly and reassembly of an AR-15 platform rifle, performed to military specifications, with proper identification of all components and their functions." The challenge was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its implications. Anyone could memorize part names or repeat technical specifications, but actually demonstrating competence under observation required the kind of expertise that couldn't be faked or improvised. Tyler's face went pale as he realized that his months of confident posturing were about to be tested by someone who would recognize incompetence immediately. "Furthermore," Reed continued, "I want to see the reassembly performed within a time frame that demonstrates genuine proficiency rather than fumbling through procedures. Let's say 10 seconds for complete reassembly." Craig's jaw dropped. 10 seconds? That's impossible. Nobody can reassemble a rifle that quickly. Reed's expression suggested she had heard similar protests before. "Ms. Barnes, is 10 seconds achievable for someone with proper training?" Jessica studied the disassembled AR-15, her mind automatically cataloging the components and visualizing the reassembly sequence that had become second nature. During her years of military service, the weapon was a standard civilian configuration, simpler than the military variants she had maintained under combat conditions. "For someone with adequate training and experience, yes," she said quietly. 10 seconds is achievable." Tyler stepped forward, his voice carrying the desperate bravado of someone whose expertise was about to be exposed as fraudulent. "I'll take the challenge. I've been working on these rifles for over 2 years." Reed nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Mr. Brooks, please proceed." What followed was a masterclass in the difference between confidence and competence. Tyler approached the disassembled rifle with obvious nervousness, his hands uncertain as they moved among components he handled daily, but didn't truly understand. He fumbled with the bolt carrier group, struggled to properly align the upper and lower receivers, and spent precious seconds searching for pins that he should have been able to locate instinctively. After 90 seconds of increasingly frantic effort, Tyler managed to produce something that resembled a functional rifle, though Jessica could see from across the room that the gas key wasn't properly tightened and the bolt wasn't fully seated in the carrier. The weapon would probably function for a few rounds before malfunctioning, but it wasn't assembled to specifications that would ensure reliability. "Time," Reed announced, making notes that clearly indicated Tyler's performance had been unimpressive. "Mr. Brooks, your technique suggests familiarity with the process, but lacks the precision and speed that indicates genuine proficiency." Tyler's face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "That's a pretty tight time frame. Most people would need more time to—" "Ms. Barnes," Reed interrupted, "would you care to demonstrate?" The moment had arrived. Jessica could maintain her invisibility by declining the challenge, preserving the low profile she had cultivated for 14 months, while watching Eagle Point's technical incompetence destroy what could have been a successful operation. Or she could step forward and demonstrate capabilities that would forever change how everyone in the room perceived her. She thought of David, who had taught her that expertise without courage was just theoretical knowledge. She thought of the customers who had received dangerous advice from Tyler's confident ignorance. She thought of the federal violations that had been accumulating because nobody had been willing to prioritize competence over comfort. "I'll take the challenge," Jessica said, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had performed under much more difficult conditions. As she approached the workbench, Jessica felt the transformation that had always preceded important missions. The nervous cashier disappeared, replaced by the weapons specialist who had kept soldiers alive through 3 combat deployments. Her hands moved with the unconscious precision of someone who had performed this task thousands of times in conditions ranging from controlled training environments to firefights where speed meant survival. Reed positioned herself to observe closely, her professional demeanor suggesting she understood the significance of what she was about to witness. "Ms. Barnes, when you're ready." Jessica picked up the lower receiver, her hands automatically checking the trigger group and safety selector, while her mind visualized the complete reassembly sequence. Every component had its place. Every movement had been practiced until it transcended conscious thought. Every step had been refined through years of training and real-world application. "Begin," Reed announced, starting her stopwatch. What happened next would become the stuff of legend at Eagle Point Firearms Gear, a demonstration of expertise so far beyond anything the staff had witnessed that it redefined their understanding of what professional competence looked like. Jessica's hands moved with fluid precision, each component finding its place with the inevitability of a perfectly choreographed dance. The bolt slid into the carrier with a metallic whisper. The carrier group dropped into the upper receiver with practiced ease, and the charging handle locked into position with the decisive click of machinery operating exactly as designed. Upper and lower receivers mated with perfect alignment, the takedown pins sliding home with the authority of someone who had performed this operation under conditions where failure meant death. The weapon transformed from scattered components to functional tool, with the smooth efficiency of someone for whom this was muscle memory rather than conscious effort. "Time," Reed announced, her voice carrying a note of amazement that suggested even she hadn't expected what she had just witnessed. Jessica set the completed rifle on the workbench, automatically performing the safety checks that verified proper assembly. The weapon was perfect, every component properly aligned and secured, every function verified through movements so automatic they seemed effortless. 8 seconds, Reed said, studying her stopwatch with the expression of someone who had just witnessed something extraordinary. "Ms. Barnes, that was the most impressive demonstration of technical proficiency I've seen in 15 years of conducting these inspections." The showroom fell silent as the implications of what had just happened sank in. The quiet cashier who had been dismissed, mocked, and marginalized for 14 months had just demonstrated expertise that made everyone else in the building look like amateurs. Tyler stared at Jessica as if she had revealed herself to be an alien, while Craig processed the reality that he had been humiliating someone whose qualifications made his entire staff look incompetent. But Jessica's demonstration had accomplished more than just proving her technical abilities. It had provided Reed with evidence that Eagle Point possessed the expertise necessary to address its operational failures, if the management was wise enough to utilize it properly. "Mr. Thompson," Reed said, turning toward Craig with an expression that suggested his career was hanging in the balance, "we need to discuss some immediate changes in your operational structure." The woman they had called just a cashier had just proven that the most dangerous assumption in any workplace is underestimating the quiet person, who everyone thinks doesn't matter. Eagle Point was about to discover that their salvation had been standing behind the register for over a year, waiting for someone to notice that she was exactly what they needed. The 8 seconds that had just elapsed would be dissected and analyzed for years to come. But in the immediate aftermath of Jessica's demonstration, Eagle Point Firearms and Gear experienced the kind of stunned silence that follows earth-shattering revelations. Amanda Reed stared at her stopwatch as if it had malfunctioned, while Craig Thompson processed the reality that his career had just been saved by the woman he had spent months systematically humiliating. "Ms. Barnes," Reed said, her voice carrying a mixture of professional admiration and genuine amazement, "in 15 years of conducting operational assessments, I have never witnessed a demonstration of technical proficiency that approaches what you just performed. That was absolutely extraordinary." Jessica remained calm, though she could feel the weight of every eye in the store focused on her with newfound respect and not a little fear. The invisible cashier had just revealed capabilities that transcended anything her colleagues had imagined possible, and the implications were still sinking in throughout the showroom. "More importantly," Reed continued, "your demonstration proves that Eagle Point possesses the technical expertise necessary to address the operational deficiencies I've identified. The question now becomes whether management has the wisdom to properly utilize that expertise." Tyler Brooks stood frozen beside his own botched reassembly attempt, his face cycling through disbelief, embarrassment, and the dawning realization that he had been confidently explaining firearms to someone whose knowledge made him look like a complete amateur. The rifle Jessica had assembled in 8 seconds was perfect in every detail, while his 90-second effort had produced a weapon that might not survive a full magazine. "How?" Tyler asked weakly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the store's ventilation system. "How is that even possible?" Jessica looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Tyler's incompetence had been dangerous, but it had also been genuine. He truly believed he was qualified for responsibilities that exceeded his capabilities. The real problem was a management structure that had prioritized confidence over competence, allowing enthusiasm to substitute for expertise. "Muscle memory," Jessica replied simply. "When you've performed a task under pressure thousands of times, your hands know what to do without conscious thought. That's what happens when training becomes instinct." Reed moved closer to examine the rifle Jessica had assembled, her professional demeanor reflecting someone who understood the significance of what she was observing. "Miss Barnes, would you mind if I conducted a function check on this weapon?" Jessica nodded, stepping back to allow Reed access to the rifle. She watched as the district manager performed a thorough inspection that would verify whether the rapid assembly had compromised any aspect of the weapon's functionality or safety. Reed's examination was methodical and professional, checking the bolt's headspace, verifying the gas key alignment, testing the trigger group function, and ensuring that every component was properly seated and secured. After several minutes of detailed inspection, she looked up with an expression of genuine amazement. "Perfect," Reed announced. "This rifle is assembled to specifications that exceed factory standards. Every component is properly aligned, every tolerance is within acceptable parameters, and every safety mechanism is functioning correctly." The pronouncement hit the assembled staff like a physical blow. Jessica hadn't just performed a parlor trick or demonstrated casual familiarity with firearms. She had assembled a weapon to professional standards while working at a speed that suggested capabilities far beyond anything they had encountered. Craig Thompson found his voice, though it carried none of the authority he had wielded so casually. During his months of harassment, "Jessica, we didn't know. Your qualifications, your experience. Why didn't you ever mention that you could do this?" Jessica looked at him with the steady gaze of someone who had endured systematic dismissal, while possessing expertise that could have prevented every problem they now faced. "I tried to help with technical issues multiple times over the past 14 months. Each time, I was told to stay in my lane and leave the important work to people who were supposedly qualified." The reminder of his own behavior hung in the air, like an accusation that couldn't be denied or deflected. Craig had not only dismissed Jessica's capabilities, he had actively prevented her from contributing knowledge that could have saved his career and the store's reputation. Mike Collins stepped forward, his expression reflecting someone who had suspected Jessica's true capabilities, but hadn't imagined their full scope. "This explains everything I've been observing for months. The way you handled that customer's rifle problem, your attention to detail with inventory, your understanding of technical issues that everyone else missed." Reed turned her attention back to Craig, her expression suggesting that career-defining decisions were about to be made. "Mr. Thompson, let me be very clear about the situation you're facing. The operational deficiencies I've documented represent violations serious enough to trigger federal investigation and potential license revocation." Craig's face went pale as the full implications of his management failures crystallized into immediate threats to his livelihood and potentially his freedom. The systematic negligence that had characterized Eagle Point's operations wasn't just embarrassing. It was potentially criminal. "However," Reed continued, "Ms. Barnes' demonstration proves that your facility possesses the technical expertise necessary to implement corrective measures and maintain compliance with federal regulations. The question is whether you're prepared to make the organizational changes necessary to utilize that expertise effectively." The proposal implicit in Reed's statement was both a lifeline and a complete reversal of Eagle Point's existing hierarchy. Jessica would need to be given authority commensurate with her expertise, while employees like Tyler would need to acknowledge their limitations and accept training from someone they had dismissed as unqualified. "What kind of changes are you suggesting?" Craig asked, though his tone suggested he already understood that his authority was about to be significantly diminished. Reed consulted her notes, outlining conditions that would either save Eagle Point or serve as the framework for its closure. "Ms. Barnes will be appointed as your new technical operations manager, with full authority over inventory control, repair procedures, and compliance documentation. All customer technical advice will be reviewed and approved by her before being provided to clients." Tyler started to protest, but Reed cut him off with a look that suggested his input was neither requested nor relevant. "Mr. Brooks, you will undergo remedial training under Ms. Barnes' supervision, and you will not perform any modifications or repairs without her direct oversight until you demonstrate competency to federal standards." The conditions continued, each one representing a complete restructuring of Eagle Point's operational authority. Jessica would have veto power over sales practices that created compliance risks, mandatory review authority for all technical procedures, and responsibility for training programs that would bring the entire staff up to professional standards. "These changes are non-negotiable," Reed concluded. "Either Eagle Point implements these measures immediately, or I recommend license revocation and federal investigation of the violations I've documented." Jessica felt the weight of sudden responsibility settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. The invisibility she had cultivated for 14 months was gone forever, replaced by authority that would make her the most important person in the building. The quiet cashier was about to become the expert whose decisions would determine Eagle Point's survival. "Ms. Barnes," Reed said, Are you willing to accept this level of responsibility? Jessica looked around the store that had dismissed her expertise while desperately needing it, at colleagues who had mocked her knowledge while demonstrating their own ignorance, at a management structure that had prioritized appearance over competence until crisis forced recognition of reality. Yes, she said quietly. I'm willing to help Eagle Point become what it should have been all along. The 8-second miracle had just transformed Eagle Point Firearms and Gear from a failing operation into a business with the potential for excellence. But the real miracle wasn't Jessica's technical demonstration. It was the recognition that expertise comes in unexpected packages, and that the most valuable person in any organization might be the one everyone assumes matters least. The woman they had called just a cashier was about to prove that quiet competence, when finally recognized and properly utilized, could transform failure into success and turn dismissal into respect that would last for decades. The transformation of Eagle Point Firearms and Gear began immediately, and Craig Thompson's fall from workplace tyrant to irrelevant middle manager was as swift as it was complete. Within hours of Amanda Reed's ultimatum, Jessica Barnes found herself occupying Craig's former office while he was relegated to administrative duties that kept him away from any operational decisions that mattered. Your first priority, Reed explained as she reviewed Jessica's new responsibilities, is to conduct a complete audit of every transaction, modification, and inventory movement from the past year. I need a comprehensive report that identifies all potential violations and the steps required to achieve compliance. Jessica accepted the massive responsibility with the same calm professionalism she had brought to every challenge during her 14 months of invisibility. The woman who had been organizing ammunition by grain weight just days earlier was now responsible for saving a business that employed 12 people and served thousands of customers throughout Central Texas. The staff's reaction to the sudden power reversal was a study in human nature under pressure. Mike Collins adapted immediately, recognizing that Jessica's promotion was both deserved and necessary for Eagle Point's survival. His law enforcement background had taught him to respect competence regardless of its source, and he became Jessica's most valuable ally in implementing the changes Reed had mandated. Tyler Brooks, however, struggled with a reality that challenged everything he believed about his own expertise. The confident technician who had dismissed Jessica's knowledge was now required to undergo training from the woman he had mocked, a humiliation that proved more difficult than accepting his own limitations. I don't understand how this happened, Tyler complained to Brandon Walsh during their lunch break, his voice carrying the bewildered tone of someone whose worldview had been shattered. Yesterday she was just a cashier, and today she's telling me how to do my job. Brandon nodded sympathetically, though his own sales practices were under review by Jessica's new compliance protocols. It doesn't make sense. How does someone go from scanning barcodes to being an expert on federal firearms law? Their conversation revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had created Eagle Point's problems. They assumed that expertise was obvious and that competence could be measured by confidence and job titles. The possibility that someone might possess capabilities beyond their apparent position was outside their conceptual framework. Jessica, meanwhile, was discovering the full scope of Eagle Point's operational chaos. Her systematic review revealed problems that exceeded even her worst-case estimates from the inventory punishment assignments Craig had given her. The federal violations weren't just clerical errors. They represented systematic negligence that could have resulted in criminal charges against multiple employees. We have 47 firearms with serial number discrepancies, she reported to Reed during their daily progress meeting. 36 modifications performed without proper ATF documentation, and over 200 instances where sales advice created potential legal liability for customers. Reed's expression grew more grim with each item on Jessica's list. How long will it take to achieve compliance? Jessica consulted the implementation timeline she had developed using military project management techniques. 6 months for complete remediation, assuming full cooperation from staff and adequate resources for corrective measures. Some violations will require voluntary disclosure to a TF, which could trigger additional scrutiny. The scope of the cleanup operation was staggering, but Jessica approached it with the systematic thoroughness that had made her valuable to special operations units. Every discrepancy was documented, every violation was categorized, and every corrective action was planned with the precision of someone who understood that failure to achieve compliance would destroy the business. Craig's role in the new organizational structure was both humiliating and instructive. Reed had stripped him of operational authority while maintaining his employment, creating a situation where he could observe Jessica's competence while reflecting on his own failures. The man who had confidently dismissed her expertise was now watching her solve problems he hadn't even recognized existed. "I owe you an apology," Craig said during one of Jessica's few breaks from the intensive compliance project. "I was wrong about your qualifications, and I was wrong about how I treated you." Jessica looked up from the bound book entries she was cross-referencing with a TF documentation. Craig's apology was sincere, but it couldn't undo 14 months of systematic disrespect or the problems his mismanagement had created. "The apology is appreciated," she replied diplomatically, "but the important thing now is fixing the problems and ensuring they don't happen again." Craig nodded, understanding that Jessica's focus on solutions rather than recriminations represented a professionalism he had never displayed himself. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Jessica considered the question carefully. Craig's authority was gone, but his knowledge of Eagle Point's history and customer relationships could be useful if properly channeled. "You can help by being honest about problems you've been aware of but haven't addressed. Full disclosure now will prevent bigger problems later when a TF conducts their compliance review." The request for honesty was both generous and strategic. Jessica understood that successful remediation required complete information, regardless of how embarrassing that information might be for the people who had created the problems. Over the following weeks, Eagle Point's transformation became visible to customers and staff alike. Tyler's repair work improved dramatically under Jessica's supervision, though his ego struggled with receiving instruction from someone he had considered beneath notice. Brandon's sales practices became more conservative as Jessica's compliance protocols eliminated the high-pressure techniques that had generated revenue while creating legal exposure. Most importantly, the culture of confident ignorance that Craig had fostered was replaced by an environment where admitting uncertainty was encouraged and seeking expert advice was considered professional rather than weak. Jessica instituted training programs that elevated the entire staff's competence while creating systems that prevented individual mistakes from becoming systemic problems. "The transformation is remarkable," Reed observed during her follow-up visit 6 weeks after the initial crisis. "Customer complaints have dropped to 0, employee confidence is higher, and your compliance metrics are approaching industry best practices." Jessica accepted the praise with characteristic modesty, though she felt genuine satisfaction in seeing Eagle Point become the professional operation it should have been from the beginning. The foundation was always here. It just needed proper leadership and systems that prioritized competence over appearances. Reed's smile suggested she understood exactly what Jessica meant. "Speaking of leadership, I have an offer to discuss with you. Our district needs a new regional compliance manager. Someone with the technical expertise and management skills to prevent problems like this from developing at other locations." The promotion opportunity represented vindication beyond anything Jessica had imagined when she first walked through Eagle Point's doors 14 months earlier. From invisible cashier to regional manager was a career trajectory that validated every patient hour she had spent documenting problems and preparing for the moment when her expertise would finally be recognized. But as Jessica considered the offer, she realized that her journey at Eagle Point had taught her something more valuable than career advancement. She had learned that expertise without courage was just theoretical knowledge, and that staying invisible, while safe, meant allowing incompetence to flourish when competence could make a real difference. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as just a cashier was about to discover that recognition, when it comes for the right reasons, creates opportunities to impact far more than just one struggling business. Her demonstration at Eagle Point was about to become a catalyst for changes that would ripple throughout an entire industry. The 8-second miracle had proven that the most valuable people are often the ones everyone assumes matter least. And Jessica Barnes was about to make sure that lesson reached every workplace where quiet competence was being overlooked, while loud incompetence was being rewarded. 6 months after her 8-second demonstration transformed Eagle Point Firearms and Gear, Jessica Barnes stood before a conference room filled with district managers, regional supervisors, and corporate executives from across the Lone Star Sporting Goods chain. The presentation she was about to deliver would establish protocols that would change how the company identified, developed, and utilized employee expertise at over 200 locations nationwide. The Barnes Protocol, as Amanda Reed had named it, wasn't just about firearms compliance or technical competence. It was a comprehensive approach to human resource management that recognized expertise wherever it existed, regardless of job titles or organizational hierarchies. The lessons learned from Eagle Point's near collapse had implications that extended far beyond one struggling gun store in Austin, Texas. "Ladies and gentlemen," Reed announced to the assembled corporate leadership, "I want you to meet Jessica Barnes, who has revolutionized our understanding of how to identify and utilize employee capabilities. 6 months ago, she was working as a cashier while possessing expertise that exceeded our entire technical staff. Today, she's going to explain how we can prevent similar oversights across our entire organization." Jessica approached the podium with the calm confidence that had become her trademark since accepting her role as regional compliance manager. The transformation from invisible cashier to corporate presenter represented more than just career advancement. It embodied a fundamental shift in how organizations could recognize and develop talent that might otherwise remain hidden. "The Eagle Point case study," Jessica began, "demonstrates what happens when management assumes that expertise is always obvious, and that job performance can be measured by confidence rather than competence. For 14 months, I documented systematic failures while being dismissed as unqualified to contribute solutions." She clicked to her first slide, which displayed the staggering statistics from Eagle Point's pre-intervention period: 47 compliance violations, 36 illegal modifications, over 200 instances of dangerous customer advice, and inventory discrepancies that could have triggered federal investigation. These problems weren't caused by lack of resources or inadequate equipment, Jessica continued. They were caused by a management culture that prioritized appearance over substance and punished employees who questioned established procedures or offered alternative approaches. The audience of corporate executives shifted uncomfortably as they recognized similar patterns in their own operations. How many locations were struggling with problems that could be solved by employees whose expertise was being overlooked? How many compliance issues could be prevented by listening to staff members who understood technical requirements better than their supervisors? The Barnes Protocol addresses these issues through 3 fundamental changes in management approach. Jessica explained, advancing to her core recommendations. First, systematic competency assessment that evaluates actual skills rather than assumed qualifications. Second, reverse mentoring programs that allow junior employees to train senior staff in areas where they possess superior expertise. Third, anonymous suggestion systems that encourage technical input from all employees regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. Reed watched the presentation with satisfaction, knowing that Jessica's insights were based on Hard-won experience rather than theoretical management concepts. The woman who had been dismissed as just a cashier was now teaching corporate executives how to identify and develop talent that traditional assessment methods consistently missed. "Let me give you a concrete example," Jessica said, clicking to a slide that showed Eagle Point's performance metrics before and after implementing her protocols. Customer complaints dropped by 94%. Compliance violations were eliminated entirely, and employee satisfaction scores increased by 60%. Most importantly, we identified 3 additional employees with specialized expertise that had been completely overlooked by previous management. The transformation statistics were impressive, but Jessica knew that numbers alone wouldn't convince executives who had built their careers on traditional hierarchical management. She needed to demonstrate that the Barnes Protocol could identify hidden expertise in any organization, not just struggling firearms retailers. "I've spent the past 6 months implementing similar assessments at 12 other locations across our district," she continued. "The results have been consistently remarkable. We've discovered former military personnel working in shipping who possess logistics expertise that could revolutionize our supply chain operations. We found employees with engineering backgrounds work in customer service who could solve technical problems that have puzzled our senior staff for years." Jessica advanced to a slide showing a photograph of Maria Santos, a part-time employee at their San Antonio location who had been working in the fishing gear department while possessing a master's degree in materials science. Maria had been suggesting improvements to our rod and reel displays for 2 years, but her recommendations were ignored because she was considered just a part-time associate. When we implemented competency-based assessment, we discovered that her expertise could enhance product selection and customer education across our entire fishing gear division. The pattern was consistent across multiple locations: valuable employees whose capabilities were being wasted because traditional management approaches failed to recognize expertise that didn't conform to expected packages. The Barnes Protocol was revealing a hidden workforce of overqualified, underutilized personnel who could transform operations if given appropriate opportunities. "The financial impact has been substantial," Jessica reported, clicking to her ROI analysis. "Locations implementing the Barnes Protocol have shown average productivity increases of 35%, customer satisfaction improvements of 40%, and compliance cost reductions of 60%. More importantly, employee retention has improved dramatically as staff members feel valued for their actual contributions rather than dismissed for their apparent limitations." Corporate Vice President Robert Chun leaned forward with obvious interest. "Ms. Barnes, how do we scale this approach across 200 locations without creating administrative complexity that overwhelms our management structure?" Jessica had anticipated this question, understanding that corporate executives needed practical implementation strategies rather than theoretical frameworks. "The protocol is designed to be self-sustaining once properly established. Competency assessment becomes part of routine performance reviews. Reverse mentoring is integrated into existing training programs, and anonymous suggestion systems leverage technology we already have in place." She clicked to her implementation timeline, which showed a phased rollout that would introduce the Barnes Protocol across the entire chain over 18 months. "The key is starting with pilot programs at locations where management is already receptive to change, then using success stories to convince more traditional managers that expertise comes in unexpected packages." The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, with Jessica fielding questions that revealed both skepticism and genuine interest from corporate leadership. Some executives worried about disrupting established hierarchies, while others recognized the competitive advantages that could come from better utilizing their human resources. "The bottom line," Jessica concluded, "is that every organization has employees whose capabilities exceed their apparent qualifications. The question is whether we're going to continue overlooking that expertise or develop systems that identify and utilize it effectively. Reed stood to address the audience as Jessica's presentation concluded. The Barnes Protocol isn't just about improving our firearms compliance or technical operations. It's about creating a culture where expertise is recognized and valued regardless of where it originates. Companies that embrace this approach will have competitive advantages over those that continue to assume they know everything about their employees' capabilities. As the conference broke for lunch, several executives approached Jessica with specific questions about implementing the protocol at their locations. The interest was genuine, suggesting that Eagle Point's transformation would become the template for changes throughout the industry. The woman who had assembled an AR-15 in 8 seconds had done more than demonstrate technical proficiency. She had created a new standard for recognizing and developing human potential that would influence management practices for decades to come. The Barnes Protocol was about to prove that the most valuable transformations often begin with someone everyone assumed didn't matter. Jessica's journey from invisible cashier to corporate consultant was complete, but her impact was just beginning. The 8-second miracle at Eagle Point was about to become a movement that would change how organizations everywhere thought about expertise, authority, and the dangerous assumption that quiet people have nothing valuable to contribute. 2 years after the 8-second demonstration that changed everything, Jessica Barnes stood in the Memorial Garden of the Veterans Affairs Hospital in San Antonio, placing fresh flowers at a marker that bore her brother's name, Staff Sergeant David Barnes. Special Forces had been gone for 5 years, but his influence on Jessica's journey had never been stronger than in this moment of quiet reflection. "I think you'd be proud, Dave," she whispered to the polished granite stone. "I finally figured out how to honor what you taught me." The Barnes Protocol had become standard practice across not just Lone Star Sporting Goods, but dozens of other organizations that had recognized the competitive advantages of properly identifying and utilizing employee expertise. Jessica's consulting firm, Quiet Competence Solutions, was booked solid for the next 18 months with companies seeking to implement similar transformations in their own operations. But the numbers that mattered most to Jessica weren't found in corporate reports or profit margins. They were in the individual stories of people whose capabilities had been recognized and developed because someone had finally learned to look beyond appearances and job titles. Maria Santos, the materials science expert who had been working part-time in fishing gear, was now Lone Star's Director of Product Development, leading innovations that had revolutionized their equipment selection and customer education programs. Her suggestions, ignored for 2 years while she worked behind a counter, had become the foundation for improvements that increased customer satisfaction across the entire chain. Tommy Martinez, a military veteran who had been stocking shelves, while possessing advanced logistics training, was now managing supply chain operations for the entire southwestern region. His expertise, overlooked because management assumed warehouse workers didn't understand complex distribution systems, had eliminated inventory shortages and reduced shipping costs by 30%. The ripple effects extended far beyond individual career advancement. Companies implementing the Barnes Protocol reported cultural changes that transformed their competitive positions in ways that traditional management approaches had never achieved. When expertise was recognized and valued, regardless of its source, innovation flourished and employee engagement reached levels that surprised even optimistic executives. Jessica's phone buzzed with a text message from Amanda Reed, who had been promoted to regional vice president, partly on the strength of Eagle Point's transformation and the subsequent success of the Barnes Protocol implementation. Jessica just got word that Eagle Point won the Industry Excellence Award for Operational Transformation. "Tyler wants to thank you personally at the ceremony. Can you believe it?" Jessica smiled at the message, remembering Tyler Brooks' journey from confident incompetence to genuine expertise under her patient guidance. The man who had once dismissed her knowledge while fumbling through basic procedures was now one of the most skilled technicians in the district, his earlier arrogance replaced by the humble confidence that comes from actual competence. Tyler's transformation had been particularly satisfying because it demonstrated that the Barnes Protocol wasn't just about identifying hidden expertise. It was about developing potential in people who were willing to acknowledge their limitations and commit to genuine improvement. Tyler's initial resistance had given way to appreciation as he realized that learning from Jessica made him better at his job rather than diminishing his value as an employee. Craig Thompson's story was more complicated but equally instructive. His demotion from store manager to administrative assistant had been humbling, but it had also forced him to confront management approaches that had been counterproductive throughout his career. Under Jessica's mentorship, Craig had learned to recognize expertise in others and develop leadership skills based on empowerment rather than control. "I spent years thinking that being a manager meant having all the answers," Craig had told Jessica during one of their weekly coaching sessions. "You taught me that being a leader means finding people who have answers and creating environments where they can share them." Craig's redemption had culminated in his promotion to assistant regional manager, a position where his hard-won humility and newfound appreciation for diverse expertise made him far more effective than he had ever been as an authoritarian store manager. The Eagle Point location itself had become a showcase for the Barnes Protocol's effectiveness. Customers who had previously shopped there out of convenience now drove from across the state to experience the level of expertise and customer service that had made the store legendary within the firearms community. The operation that had once been failing under Craig's mismanagement was now the highest performing location in the district. But Jessica's greatest satisfaction came from the knowledge that David's lessons about courage, competence, and service had found expression in ways that would outlast any individual career or company success. The Barnes Protocol had become more than just a management system. It had evolved into a philosophy that recognized human potential wherever it existed and created opportunities for that potential to flourish. Jessica's speaking engagements at business conferences and military transition programs had spread the message to audiences far beyond the sporting goods industry. Manufacturing companies were discovering engineering expertise among their maintenance staff. Healthcare organizations were finding medical knowledge in unexpected departments. Educational institutions were recognizing teaching abilities in support personnel who had been overlooked for advancement opportunities. The most dangerous assumption any organization can make, Jessica would tell her audiences, is that they understand their employees' full capabilities based on job titles and resume summaries. Excellence often develops quietly, away from spotlights and recognition, in the hands of people who are underestimated until the moment they prove what they're truly capable of accomplishing. As Jessica prepared to leave the Memorial Garden, her phone rang with a call from a Fortune 500 CEO who had heard about the Barnes Protocol and wanted to discuss implementing it across his company's global operations. The conversation would lead to consulting contracts worth millions of dollars, but more importantly, it would create opportunities for thousands of employees whose expertise was currently being overlooked. Jessica accepted the call while walking toward her car, a Toyota Land Cruiser that had replaced the beaten Honda Civic she had driven during her months of invisibility at Eagle Point. The upgrade represented more than just improved financial circumstances. It symbolized the recognition that expertise, when properly identified and utilized, created value that benefited everyone involved. David always said that the best way to honor fallen soldiers was to live up to the potential they saw in us, Jessica said to herself as she ended the call and started the drive back to Austin. "I think I'm finally doing that." The woman who had been dismissed as just a cashier until she assembled an AR-15 in 8 Seconds had created a legacy that would influence management practices and human resource development for decades to come. Her story had proven that the most valuable people in any organization are often the ones everyone assumes matter least. And that quiet competence, when finally recognized and properly supported, can transform failure into extraordinary success. The Barnes Protocol would continue spreading, carried forward by executives who had learned to look beyond appearances and managers who understood that expertise comes in unexpected packages. Jessica's 8-second demonstration had lasted less than 10 seconds, but its impact would resonate for generations of employees whose capabilities would be recognized because someone had finally learned that the most important person in the room might be the one everyone thinks doesn't matter. Excellence, Jessica had proven, doesn't require an audience, but when it's finally recognized, it can change everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.